On my 60th birthday, my 3 children arrived with solemn faces instead of gifts. "Mom, we've found a wonderful assisted living facility," my daughter announced, handing me glossy brochures. My sons nodded in practiced unison, explaining they'd already sold my house, the house I'd paid off 15 years ago after their father died. "The movers come tomorrow," they said. "It's for your own good." I laughed then, a genuine laugh that startled them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rehearsed sympathy turned to confusion as I walked to my study and returned with 3 identical folders. "I've been expecting this day," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years, "and I've prepared something special for each of you." The morning had started like any other milestone birthday in recent years, with solitude. I'd risen early, made myself a cappuccino with the machine I'd splurged on after retirement, and watched the sunrise from my garden. 60 years old. Not particularly remarkable in the grand scheme of things, but a convenient milestone for what my children had planned. They arrived precisely at 11 a.m., all 3 of them together, unusual in itself. Caroline, my eldest, an investment banker with permanently furrowed brows. James, my middle child, who'd built a successful real estate business with seed money I'd provided after selling my vacation property. And Michael, my youngest, who despite his creative writing degree, had never finished a novel but somehow maintained an upscale lifestyle beyond his modest teaching salary. "Surprise," they called half-heartedly as I opened the door. No balloons, no cake, just 3 adults with manufactured smiles and a collective mission. I invited them in, of course. The house was immaculate as always. At 60, I was still perfectly capable of maintaining my home, tending my garden, and managing my finances. Facts that seemed to frustrate rather than reassure my children in recent years. "Tea?" I offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "Mom, let's sit down first," Carolyn said, using the same tone she'd employed when telling me her father had terminal cancer 12 years ago. "We need to talk about something important." I settled into my favorite armchair, the one with the perfect view of the Japanese maple Robert and I had planted on our 10th anniversary. "I'm listening," I said, folding my hands in my lap. They exchanged glances, a choreographed dance of concern they must have practiced. James cleared his throat and took the lead. "Mom, we've been worried about you living alone in this big house," he began. "The stairs, the maintenance, the yard work. It's too much for someone your age." "I manage quite well," I replied, though I knew this was merely the opening act. "But for how long?" Caroline interjected. "We've found the most wonderful place, Sunset Meadows. Private rooms, activities, medical staff on site. You'll never have to worry about cooking or cleaning again." Michael, always the emotional one, reached for my hand. "We want you to be safe, Mom. We're worried sick every time you don't answer your phone right away." I noticed he was wearing a new watch, Rolex if I wasn't mistaken. Interesting purchase for someone who claimed perpetual financial struggles when asking for loans that were never repaid. Caroline pulled brochures from her designer handbag and spread them across the coffee table. Glossy photos of smiling seniors playing bingo and eating in communal dining rooms. "We've already put down a deposit to hold your spot," she said proudly, as if she'd secured front-row tickets to a sold-out concert. "That's very thoughtful," I said, picking up one of the brochures. "Sunset Meadows. $5,000 monthly minimum. Well above what my children believed was my fixed income." "There's more," James said, pulling out a folder of his own. "As you know, the housing market is hot right now. This neighborhood, especially." My heart thumped once, hard, against my ribs. Here it was. "We found a buyer for the house," he continued, unable to meet my eyes. "Over market value. The money will easily cover Sunset Meadows for years." "You've found a buyer for my house?" I repeated, my voice deliberately even. "We know it seems sudden," Caroline jumped in, "but it makes perfect sense financially. This house is worth over $1 million now, and you're rattling around in it alone." "The thing is," Michael added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the buyer needs to close quickly. They've already signed the preliminary paperwork." "And when is quickly?" I asked. James had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The movers come tomorrow. We've already arranged everything." "I see," I said, setting down the brochure. "And the paperwork? When did I sign the paperwork to sell my home?" An uncomfortable silence descended. Caroline recovered first. "Remember last month when we brought those insurance documents for you to update?" she said. "The sale agreement was included in that packet." "Was it?" I asked mildly. "How convenient." I rose then, moving to the window. My garden was in full bloom. Hydrangeas, roses, and the carefully tended herbs I'd started growing after retirement. Beyond the garden lay the neighborhood I'd called home for 30 years. The place where I'd raised 3 children as a working single mother after Robert died, leaving me with a mortgage, 3 teenagers, and his life insurance that barely covered the funeral expenses. I turned back to my children, these strangers wearing familiar faces. "I'd like to see these papers I supposedly signed," I said. More glances exchanged. Caroline reached into her briefcase and withdrew a document folder. "It's all perfectly legal, Mom. We had your best interests at heart." "I'm sure you did," I replied, not reaching for the folder. Instead, I walked toward my study. "I have something to show you as well. Please wait here." In my study, the one room my children rarely entered, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and removed 3 identical folders I'd prepared months ago, when I first noticed James photographing my house without explanation, when Caroline began asking pointed questions about my will, when Michael started bringing up memory concerns after I questioned a missing withdrawal from my account. I returned to the living room, where my children waited with the false patience of predators. The heavy folders in my hands felt like shields. "I've been expecting this day," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. "And I've prepared something special for each of you." Their expressions, a mixture of confusion, wariness, and the first flickers of alarm, told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not calculated preparation, but they had forgotten who I was before I was their mother. The woman who put herself through law school while working full-time, who specialized in elder law and financial fraud before shifting to corporate contracts, who maintained her license and connections even after retirement. They had underestimated me. It was a mistake they would not make again. Long before my children plotted to seize my home, I had built a life of quiet strength and calculated independence. After Robert died of a heart attack at 45, leaving me with 3 teenagers and a mountain of hidden debt, I'd made a promise to myself. I would never be financially vulnerable again. I sold our vacation cabin, the only asset not entangled in debt, and used the proceeds to finish my law degree while working as a paralegal. My days began at 5 a.m. and ended well past midnight, a punishing schedule that left little time for grief but kept a roof over our heads and food on the table. The children were too young to understand the precariousness of our situation. They only knew that Mom was suddenly less available, more strict about expenses, and insistent on educational excellence. By the time Caroline entered college, I had established myself as a respected attorney specializing in elder law. The irony doesn't escape me now. I spent 15 years protecting seniors from financial exploitation, often by their own families, before transitioning to corporate work for its better hours and higher pay. My clients were predominantly women my own age, widowed or divorced, suddenly navigating complex financial waters alone, vulnerable to those who saw them as easy targets. Independence requires vigilance, I would tell them. Document everything. Trust, but verify. And always have a contingency plan. I paid off the mortgage on my house by taking no vacations for a decade, driving the same car until it finally died at 220,000 miles, and investing carefully in a diversified portfolio. My children viewed these choices as unnecessary frugality rather than strategic planning. They never knew about the spreadsheets tracking every expense, the retirement projections I updated monthly, the careful balance I maintained between helping them and securing my future. "Mom, you should add me to your accounts just in case something happens," James would mention casually. "Mom, don't you think this house is too much work?" "I worry about you here alone," Michael would say, his eyes surveying the property with an appraiser's calculation rather than concern. When James needed startup capital for his real estate business, I sold stocks to provide it, as an investment, not a gift. though the paperwork reflecting this fact was safely stored where he couldn't access it. When Caroline faced a difficult divorce, I covered her legal expenses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Michael struggled to find stable work after college, I subsidized his rent for 3 years. I helped them because I could, because they were my children, because I wanted them to succeed. But I never forgot the lessons of those desperate years after Robert's death. Beneath my generosity ran a current of caution that my children mistook for paranoia as I aged. "Mom, why do you still maintain your own investments? My financial advisor could handle everything," Caroline would suggest. "Mom, you should add me to your accounts, just in case something happens," James would mention casually. "Mom, don't you think this house is too much work? I worry about you here alone," Michael would say, his eyes surveying the property with an appraiser's calculation rather than concern. I deflected these suggestions with practiced ease, nodding and promising to consider their advice while doing precisely what I had planned all along. My apparent acquiescence pacified them, reinforcing their perception of me as a somewhat naive older woman who needed their guidance. This perception shifted subtly after my 75th birthday. I noticed longer pauses when I searched for names, occasional word-finding difficulties. Normal aging, my doctor assured me, but my children seized upon these moments as evidence of decline. Their suggestions became more frequent, more insistent. "I think you misplaced your checkbook again, Mom. Let me help you organize your finances. You seemed confused about your medication schedule. Wouldn't it be easier to have someone monitoring that?" Small incidents magnified into patterns, patterns transformed into narratives, narratives that served their purposes rather than reflecting my reality. I began keeping a journal documenting these interactions, noting dates, times, and exactly what was said. I recorded phone conversations, saved emails, and carefully documented my daily activities and mental acuity. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. 20 years of legal practice had taught me the value of contemporaneous records. 6 months before my 60th birthday, I noticed James taking photographs of my house interior while claiming to be, quote, checking the roof leak. I found Caroline going through my filing cabinet when she thought I was napping. Michael began bringing up concerns about my memory after I questioned him about an unauthorized withdrawal from my checking account, a withdrawal I had deliberately allowed to proceed to establish evidence. I consulted with Eleanor Winston, my former law partner, and one of the few people I still trusted implicitly. Over lunch at a restaurant far from my neighborhood, I laid out my suspicions. "They're setting the stage for something," I told her, "building a narrative of incapacity." Eleanor, now 70 herself and still practicing, nodded grimly. "Classic predatory behavior. What's your evidence?" I slid a USB drive across the table. "Everything's here. Documented, unauthorized access to my accounts, recordings of conversations, photographs of them searching my home, plus financial records showing substantial transfers to each of them over the years, all documented as loans with repayment terms they've ignored." "And your cognitive status?" she asked bluntly. "Had a full neuropsychological evaluation 3 months ago. Perfect scores across all domains. Report is on the drive." Eleanor pocketed the drive. "What do you think they're planning?" "Something imminent. They've been asking about my birthday plans with unusual interest." "A classic timeline marker," she agreed. "So what's your countermove?" I smiled for the first time that lunch. "I'm preparing 3 identical folders, one for each of my children. Inside will be everything they don't want exposed, financial, legal, and personal, plus a 4th folder with my attorney to be released publicly if anything happens to me." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're not just documenting, you're building leverage." "I learned from the best," I replied. Eleanor had taught me that the best defense was a strategically planned offense. "They think I'm an easy target, a lonely old woman desperate for their approval. They've forgotten who I was before I was their mother." "And who was that?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Someone who survived worse than their betrayal," I said quietly. "Someone who rebuilt from nothing once before, and can do it again if necessary." As my birthday approached, I finalized my preparations. I updated my will, transferred key assets into an irrevocable trust, secured power of attorney with Eleanor rather than my children, and compiled the evidence folders. I slept surprisingly well during those final weeks, the calm that comes not from ignorance but from thorough preparation. The morning of my 60th birthday, I woke early and watched the sunrise. Whatever happened today would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one way or another. My relationship with my children had always been complicated, a tapestry of love, sacrifice, and unspoken expectations woven through with threads of my own making. I wasn't a perfect mother. Perfection wasn't possible under the circumstances. After Robert died, I became both parents, provider and nurturer, disciplinarian and confidant. The balance wasn't always right. Caroline, my firstborn, was 16 when her father died. She had his analytical mind and ambition, along with a teenager's conviction that parents existed primarily to disrupt plans. Overnight, she became my reluctant partner in keeping the family afloat. While I attended night classes, she supervised homework and made sure dinner happened, resentment simmering beneath her competence. "It's not fair," she'd hiss after her siblings were in bed. "I didn't ask for this responsibility." "Neither did I'd respond, too exhausted for gentler words. But here we are. That exchange became the foundation of our adult relationship. Mutual capability tinged with resentment, respect, without true warmth. Caroline succeeded brilliantly in her career, marrying equally ambitious David and producing 2 perfectly scheduled children who called me Grandmother Eleanor, rather than anything more intimate. She consulted me on financial matters but dismissed my input on anything emotional. Our conversations remained transactional, efficient. James, my middle child at 14 when crisis struck, responded differently. Where Caroline turned rigid, James became fluid, adapting to circumstances with charm and strategic acquiescence. He discovered early that appearing to comply while pursuing his own agenda was effective. He became the family peacemaker, smoothing Caroline's edges and encouraging Michael's withdrawn nature, all while quietly securing his own advantages. "Mom works so hard for us," he'd say soothingly when the others complained. "The least we can do is make things easier for her." Yet his room remained perpetually messy, his homework mysteriously incomplete, his chores forgotten until reminded. His smile, so like his father's, melted my resolve to enforce consequences. As an adult, James channeled this interpersonal intelligence into real estate, becoming the agent everyone trusted, despite fine print that always favored his position. He married 3 times, each wife younger and more accommodating than the last. His children, one from each marriage, regarded me with the polite interest one might show a distant acquaintance. When he called, he always wanted something, wrapped in layers of flattery and nostalgic references. "Remember how you always said I could spot potential others missed?" He'd begin, before introducing his latest investment opportunity that just happened to require immediate capital. Michael, only 12 when Robert died, suffered most visibly from his father's absence. Sensitive and introspective, he retreated into books and fantasy worlds where fathers didn't clutch their chests and collapse on kitchen floors. His academic brilliance became both shield and identity. While Caroline organized and James charmed, Michael observed from corners, absorbing patterns and vulnerabilities. "People are disappointing," he told me once during his sullen teenage years. "Books make more sense." I worried about him most. His isolation, his difficulty connecting, his judgmental perspective on others' choices. Yet he surprised me by becoming an engaging English teacher, transforming his introversion into thoughtful analysis that resonated with students. He married Rachel, a practical nurse with a nurturing manner that complemented his intellectual focus. Their relationship seemed genuinely supportive. Their son Thomas, the light of Michael's life. Of my 3 children, Michael called most consistently, remembered birthdays without reminders, and seemed interested in my life beyond what I could provide. I allowed myself to believe our relationship transcended the utilitarian bonds I shared with his siblings. This complex family dynamic shaped our interactions as they established their adult lives, and I reconfigured mine. After paying off the mortgage, I returned to my own interests, converting the basement into a pottery studio, joining a hiking group that explored local wilderness areas, taking Spanish classes with the goal of eventually spending winters in Mexico. I built a life that was purposefully mine, not an extension of my children's needs. While to Doug, Bachabayi le mazalanise sati bachabax ben he. They watched this transformation with reactions that should have warned me. Caroline frowned at my frivolous expenditures on pottery equipment. James questioned the wisdom of basement renovations that, quote, wouldn't add resale value. Michael expressed concern about my solo hiking adventures, citing accident statistics for women my age. Their visits became less frequent but more scrutinizing. Caroline inspected my refrigerator contents, noting expiration dates. James assessed maintenance issues with exaggerated concern. Michael subtly tested my memory with questions about books we'd discussed months earlier. Yet alongside this growing surveillance, they increasingly sought financial assistance. Caroline's private school tuition for her children. James's bridge loans between property flips. Michael's summer writing retreat that would finally produce the novel he'd been planning for a decade. Each request came wrapped in compliments about my financial acumen and assurances that this would be the last time they imposed. I helped when I could, always with clear terms. Loans documented with repayment schedules. Investments with defined partnership agreements. Educational expenses paid directly to institutions rather than through my children. These boundaries were necessary but created tension. They wanted the resources without the accountability, the support without the oversight. You don't trust us, Caroline accused after I declined to transfer funds directly to her account for her daughter's tuition. After everything we do for you. This phrase, after everything we do for you, became increasingly common in our interactions, though concrete examples of what they did remained elusive. Occasional Sunday dinners. Phone calls that inevitably turned to their needs. Holiday gatherings where I was invited but somehow peripheral to the family narrative they'd constructed. The subtle shift accelerated after my minor surgery 3 years ago, a routine gallbladder removal that Caroline transformed into a family crisis. I'd arranged everything independently. Preoperative preparations, a hospital transportation service, a home health aide for the first 2 days of recovery. My children arrived unannounced at the hospital, overriding my carefully made plans with their own. We're taking shifts staying with you, Caroline announced, her tone brooking no argument. You can't be alone after surgery at your age. I've already arranged, I began. Cancel it, James interrupted. Family takes care of family. Their care consisted largely of using my home as a base while checking in periodically, rearranging my kitchen organization to their preference, and discovering financial documents I normally kept private. When I returned from a follow-up appointment to find Michael photographing my investment statements, the last illusion of their motivation shattered. Research for a character, he explained hurriedly. A retired professional like you. I smiled and took back the papers. That evening, I moved all important documents to a safety deposit box and installed a discrete camera system throughout my home. If they were documenting me, I would document them too. The evidence would prove useful sooner than I expected. As my 60th birthday approached, their attentiveness increased dramatically. Weekly calls became daily check-ins. Unexpected visits multiplied. Each interaction included casual references to my age, subtle tests of my memory, and concerned exchanges of glances when they thought I wasn't watching. I recognized the pattern from my legal practice. The groundwork for an intervention. The only question was what form it would take and when they would make their move. The first concrete warning came disguised as thoughtfulness. 6 months before my birthday, Caroline arrived for an unexpected Sunday visit, bringing an elegant leather portfolio embossed with my initials. I thought you might want to organize your important documents, she explained, demonstrating its labeled sections. Medical, financial, property, personal. Everyone should have their affairs in order. I thanked her appropriately while noting she'd already inserted medical proxy forms with her name pre-filled, requiring only my signature. The financial section contained blank power of attorney documents, similarly prepared. I left them untouched but recognized the strategy, creating official-looking files to be discovered later as evidence of my consent. 3 weeks later, James called with exciting news about a client interested in properties like mine. Not that you'd ever sell, he assured me, but wouldn't it be interesting to know the market value? Just as information. Before I could respond, he'd arranged an appraisal for the following week. I allowed it, curious how far they would go. The appraiser spent unusual time photographing personal items alongside property features. When I received no follow-up about the supposed valuation, the purpose became clear: Documenting my belongings for future distribution, Michael's approach was more subtle. He began sharing articles about aging in community and the psychological benefits of communal living for seniors. His visits included casual comments about my home's maintenance challenges. "That step looks uneven, Mom." "Have you ever tripped there?" Or, "This second floor must be inconvenient when you're carrying laundry." He installed a medical alert app on my phone without asking, enabling location tracking I promptly disabled after he left. A week later, I discovered a small recording device beneath my kitchen table during routine cleaning, planted, I suspected, to document evidence of confusion or concerning behavior. Instead of confronting them, I began my own careful documentation. I maintained 2 calendars, one visible in the kitchen noting basic appointments, another secured in my safety deposit box recording every unusual interaction with my children, every unauthorized search of my home, every coincidental encounter with elderly care specialists who appeared in my neighborhood. I scheduled comprehensive medical examinations, securing multiple copies of reports confirming my excellent physical and cognitive health. I recorded conversations where my children misrepresented my statements or capabilities. I photographed evidence of their intrusions, moved papers, accessed computer files, rearranged belongings. Most importantly, I began subtly modifying my financial arrangements. I transferred major assets into an irrevocable trust, with my longtime friend and attorney, Eleanor Winston, as trustee. I updated my will with explicit provisions against changes made under duress. I established relationships with bank managers, documenting my concerns about potential unauthorized access attempts. 2 particularly telling incidents confirmed my suspicions about their timeline. 4 months before my birthday, Caroline insisted I accompany her to a financial seminar that turned out to be a sales presentation for Sunset Meadows Assisted Living. The director greeted me by name, suggesting Caroline had discussed my situation in detail previously. "We have a lovely room becoming available in September," she mentioned casually. "Around your birthday, isn't it?" 3 months before my birthday, James arrived with documents requiring my signature for updated insurance coverage. The stack was deliberately excessive, with important provisions buried within routine paperwork. I signed selectively, carefully reading each page despite his impatient sighs about his quote, busy schedule. Later review confirmed my suspicion. Mixed among legitimate insurance forms were property transfer authorizations and medical capacity evaluations. Michael's warning sign came via my grandson Thomas, who innocently mentioned during a visit, "Dad says we need to take lots of pictures with you at your birthday, since you'll be moving away after." "Moving where?" I asked casually. "To the old people place," Thomas replied. "Dad says it's all arranged." The final confirmation came 6 weeks before my birthday. Returning early from a pottery class canceled due to instructor illness, I found all 3 of my children in my home, using the emergency key I'd provided years ago, huddled around my dining room table with a stranger in a suit. They scattered at my entrance, hastily gathering papers. "Mom, you're home early," Caroline exclaimed, her voice unnaturally high. "Clearly," I replied, setting down my unused clay tools. "And who might this be?" The stranger extended his hand. "Gerald Winters, elder law attorney. Just helping your lovely family with some planning." "How thoughtful," I said, noting his discomfort under my steady gaze. "Planning for what, exactly?" "Just routine matters," James interjected. "Nothing important." "Nothing important requiring an attorney specializing in guardianship proceedings and an unauthorized meeting in my home while I'm supposedly away?" I kept my tone light, revealing just enough knowledge to unsettle them. They departed quickly after awkward explanations, but the message was unmistakable. My birthday would be the culmination of their preparations, a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to transfer control of my assets and determine my living situation without meaningful consent. That evening, I called Eleanor. "It's happening," I told her, "sooner than we expected." "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked around my home of 30 years, the life I'd built through determination and sacrifice. More than they could possibly imagine. I placed the 3 folders on the coffee table, one before each of my children. Their names were printed neatly on the covers, my handwriting as precise as it had been during my years of legal practice. The folders remained closed, their contents temporarily hidden but their presence disruptive to the carefully constructed narrative my children had planned for this day. "What are those?" Caroline asked, her voice sharp with sudden wariness. "Information," I replied simply. "But before we get to that, I'd like to see these papers you claim I signed." James slid the property transfer documents across the table reluctantly. I examined them without touching, immediately noting the signature that bore only a passing resemblance to my own. Decades of executing legal documents had given me a consistent signature, one I had deliberately modified 6 months ago in anticipation of exactly this scenario. "Interesting," I said. "This isn't my signature." "Mom, you signed it," Michael insisted. "We all watched you do it." "Did you?" I picked up my phone and tapped the screen a few times, because according to my calendar and credit card records, I was having lunch with Eleanor Winston at Riverview Cafe when these documents were supposedly signed. The restaurant security footage confirms this, as does the sworn affidavit from the server who attended our table for 2 hours. Their faces registered the first hint of genuine alarm. This wasn't part of their script. A mother with documentation and alibis, with evidence contradicting their careful narrative. "You're confused about the dates?" Caroline attempted, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. "No, I'm not," I said calmly. "Just as I'm not confused about the unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts, totaling $67,000 over the past 8 months. Or the fact that Sunset Meadows requires no deposit for new residents, contrary to what you claimed. Or that the house sale you've arranged is to Horizon Properties, a shell company owned by James through 3 layers of corporate entities." The silence that followed was profound. James shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. Michael looked toward the door as if contemplating escape. Caroline, ever the strategist, attempted recovery. "This is exactly why we're concerned," she said firmly. "These paranoid accusations are documented with evidence currently being reviewed by the district attorney's office," I interrupted, "including video recordings of the 3 of you searching my home, photographing my financial documents, and discussing plans to have me declared incompetent." I turned to face Michael directly. "The recording device you placed under my kitchen table was quite effective, though not in the way you intended. It captured several interesting conversations when you thought I wasn't home." Michael blanched. "I never—" "September 14th, 6:42 p.m., I recited from memory. "Once we get her declared incompetent, the trust transfers to us as health proxies. The house sale alone nets us nearly $1 million after paying off Sunset Meadows for 5 years. Your words, Michael. Your voice. Your plan." I turned to James next. "The property transfer documents are forgeries, which constitutes fraud. The unauthorized access to my accounts constitutes theft. The conspiracy to have me declared incompetent without medical justification constitutes elder abuse. Each charge carries significant penalties, including potential incarceration." Caroline, recovering fastest, switched tactics. "Mom, we've only been trying to protect you. If there have been misunderstandings—" "There are no misunderstandings," I said, my voice hardening. "Only calculated actions and their consequences. Which brings us back to these folders." I tapped the one bearing Caroline's name. Inside each folder is comprehensive documentation of what I've just described, along with specific evidence pertaining to each of you individually. "Caroline, yours includes records of the $145,000 loan for your children's education that you've made no attempt to repay despite the signed agreement. It also contains evidence of your misrepresentation to your firm's ethics committee regarding your handling of the Westridge Seniors class action settlement." Her face drained of color. That particular ethical breach could end her career if exposed. "James, your folder documents your pattern of real estate fraud, particularly the elder-targeted investment scheme you operated 3 years ago. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on those activities." James swallowed hard, his usual charm evaporated. "Michael, yours contains evidence of the tuition embezzlement from your school's literary foundation. 5 years of diverting funds intended for student programs into your personal accounts. Your principal would be particularly interested in that information." My youngest son's face crumpled. the facade of concerned offspring entirely gone. "You wouldn't," he whispered. "We're your children." "Yes, you are," I agreed, feeling a profound sadness beneath my resolve. "Which is why these folders are still closed. This isn't what I wanted, but it is what you created." I stood then, gathering the property documents from the table. "Here's what happens now. You will cancel the fraudulent house sale immediately. You will return every dollar taken from my accounts. You will cease all efforts to have me declared incompetent or to force me into any care facility." "And if we don't?" Carolyn asked, her attorney's instinct for negotiation surfacing despite her shock. "Then at 9 a.m. tomorrow, copies of these folders will be delivered to the district attorney, the State Bar Association, the school board, and every relevant regulatory authority. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades, of choices made, values modeled, and lessons unlearned. My children stared at me as if seeing a stranger, their carefully constructed image of a malleable, declining mother shattered beyond repair. "You've been planning this all along," James finally said, accusation mixing with reluctant respect in his voice. "No," I corrected him gently. "I've been protecting myself. There's a difference." After my children departed, stunned, silent, and suddenly cooperative, I poured myself a glass of the expensive Cabernet I'd been saving for this day. My hands were steady as I settled into my favorite reading chair by the window, though the emotional toll was beginning to register beneath my composed exterior. The confrontation had gone as I'd anticipated, but victory brought no joy, only a weary vindication and the heavy knowledge that relationships damaged by such betrayal could never fully heal. What my children didn't yet understand was that today's revelation represented only the visible portion of preparations years in the making. It had begun innocuously enough with a client case during my final years of legal practice. Josephine Mercer, a widow in her 70s, had been systematically defrauded by her stepson, a charming financial advisor who had gradually gained control of her substantial assets while isolating her from other family members. By the time she sought legal help, he had transferred her home into his name and relocated her to a small apartment, claiming cognitive decline that 3 independent medical evaluations subsequently disproved. "I never thought he would do this to me," Josephine had said, her dignity intact despite her circumstances. "I raised him from the age of 8. I put him through college. I trusted him completely." We won her case, recovering most of her assets and securing criminal charges against the stepson. But the experience haunted me, particularly as I observed parallels in my own children's subtle shifts in behavior as I approached retirement. Their increasing interest in my finances, their casual suggestions about downsizing, their questions about my will and medical directives. I began keeping detailed records of every financial transaction involving my children, gifts, loans, investments. I consulted with Eleanor about creating an irrevocable trust for my major assets, with her as trustee rather than my children. I updated my estate plan to include specific anti-duress provisions and requirements for independent medical evaluation before any determination of incapacity. These were reasonable precautions, not paranoid overreactions. But as my children's behavior grew more concerning, my preparations became more comprehensive. 3 years before my 60th birthday, I contracted with a private security firm specializing in digital surveillance. They installed nearly invisible cameras in common areas of my home, backed up to secure cloud storage only I could access. Initially intended as simple home security, these became invaluable documentation tools when my children began their unauthorized searches. I created a detailed inventory of my home's contents, complete with photographs and appraisals for valuable items. I established separate accounts at banks where my children had no relationships, gradually transferring funds from joint access accounts they'd insisted on, for emergency purposes. I secured my most important documents in a safety deposit box accessible only to myself and Eleanor. Most importantly, I maintained an appearance of mild obliviousness that allowed my children to underestimate me. When they mentioned financial matters, I appeared to listen vaguely while retaining every detail. When they rearranged my belongings during visits, I pretended not to notice while documenting every intrusion. When they tested my memory with subtle questions, I occasionally feigned slight confusion while recording these interactions in my detailed journal. "You're playing a dangerous game," Eleanor warned during one of our regular strategy lunches. Gathering evidence rather than confronting them directly. Confrontation without leverage would be pointless, I replied. They would simply become more careful, more secretive. I need irrefutable evidence. That evidence accumulated steadily. James photographing my financial statements when he thought I was napping. Caroline systematically testing combinations on my home safe while supposedly organizing my closet. Michael installing spyware on my computer under the guise of updating security software. Each incident documented, time-stamped, and added to my growing dossiers. I hired a forensic accountant to trace the money trail when I discovered the first unauthorized withdrawals, small amounts initially, testing my awareness, gradually increasing in frequency and amount. I consulted with a handwriting expert who documented my signature pattern and confirmed that the signatures appearing on certain documents were forgeries. I arranged for my regular physician to conduct comprehensive cognitive testing, establishing baseline proof of my mental competence that would be difficult to challenge. 6 months before my birthday, I met with District Attorney Catherine Reynolds, a former colleague familiar with elder fraud cases. I didn't file formal charges, but I established groundwork for potential prosecution, securing her commitment to review my evidence should it become necessary. I hope I never need to pursue this, I told her honestly, but hope is not a strategy. Most victims wait until after the damage is done, Catherine observed. By then, assets are often unrecoverable, and prosecution becomes challenging. Your documentation is exceptional. What my children couldn't know was that the folders I presented today contained only a fraction of the evidence I'd accumulated. The more damaging documentation, including recorded conversations explicitly discussing their plans to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized, remained secure with Eleanor, with instructions for use should my children fail to comply with my requirements. The most painful preparation had been emotional rather than legal or financial. I had to accept that the children I raised, the family I sacrificed everything to preserve after Robert's death, were capable of profound betrayal. I had to acknowledge my own role in creating adults who viewed me as a resource rather than a person, who measured my value by what I could provide rather than who I was. Most difficult of all, I had to prepare for a future fundamentally different from what I'd envisioned. One where my relationship with my children would be forever altered by the knowledge of what they had attempted and what I had done to stop them. As I sipped my wine and watched darkness settle over my garden, I wondered if they were capable of understanding that my extensive preparation revealed not paranoia but profound love. The desperate hope that by confronting their betrayal directly, with irrefutable evidence rather than emotional appeals, I might create an opportunity for genuine reconciliation rather than continued deception. Tomorrow would reveal whether that hope had any foundation in reality. Solemn. The bit-a-calved birthday confrontation dawned with uncertain promise. I had given my children 24 hours to begin making amends, canceling the fraudulent house sale, returning misappropriated funds, abandoning their plans for my institutionalization. Now I needed to ensure I had support structures in place regardless of their decision. Wichao. My first call was to Eleanor. "It's done," I told her, describing the confrontation in careful detail. They seemed shocked, but shock can transform quickly into desperation. "I've prepared for that possibility," she assured me. "The sealed evidence packets are ready for delivery if needed. I've also arranged for a security service to monitor your home for the next week. Discreet but effective. Do you think that's necessary?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "People who've committed fraud rarely surrender without a fight," she said, "especially when family dynamics are involved. Better to be over-prepared than vulnerable." Next, I contacted my bank manager Raymond Chen, with whom I'd established a relationship of trust over 15 years. I explained the situation in broad terms, emphasizing the unauthorized account access. "I'll personally monitor your accounts and place additional security protocols," Raymond promised. "And I've flagged any attempt to access your safety deposit box by anyone other than yourself." With financial safeguards strengthened, I turned to community resources. Though I'd always valued independence, I recognized that isolation would make me more vulnerable to my children's potential counterattacks. I called Martha Sullivan, coordinator of the Neighborhood Watch program I joined after retirement. "I'm dealing with a difficult family situation," I explained, balancing privacy with necessary disclosure. "There might be unexpected visitors claiming concern about my welfare." Martha understood immediately. After 30 years running a domestic violence shelter, she recognized the language of protective strategies. "We'll keep an eye out," she said simply. "No one approaches your house without us noticing." I contacted Dr. Eliza Jameson, my physician of 20 years, requesting updated documentation of my recent comprehensive health assessment. "I need multiple copies," I specified, "and a signed statement regarding my cognitive capacity." "This is about your children's behavior, isn't it?" she asked perceptively. "I've seen the pattern before. The documentation will be ready this afternoon." With professional and community support secured, I faced the more personal aspect of gathering strength. I called Margaret Chen, my closest friend since college days and godmother to Caroline. Unlike Eleanor, who knew the legal dimensions of my situation, Margaret had observed the gradual transformation of my relationship with my children over decades. "They finally made their move," I told her over lunch in my garden, safely away from indoor surveillance devices my children might have planted. Margaret listened without interruption as I detailed the betrayal and my response. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her first words unexpected. "I'm proud of you," she said firmly. "The Barbara I knew 30 years ago would have sacrificed herself to preserve the illusion of family harmony. That Barbara couldn't imagine her children capable of this," I admitted. "It's not about capability," Margaret observed, her perspective shaped by 40 years as a family therapist. "It's about opportunity, rationalization, and gradual boundary testing. They didn't start with a plan to defraud you. They began with small entitlements that went unchallenged, creating a pattern that escalated over time." Her analysis provided contextual understanding without excusing their actions. "What matters now is your path forward," she continued, "with or without their redemption." That afternoon, I met with Pastor David Kellerman from my community church. Though not particularly religious, I had maintained connection with the congregation that had supported me after Robert's death. Pastor Kellerman had known my children since they were teenagers. "I'm not seeking intervention," I clarified after explaining the situation. "My legal position is secure. What I need is spiritual guidance for navigating the aftermath." "You're mourning," he said gently, "not a death, but the loss of what you believed your family to be. That requires its own grief process." His framing helped organize my emotional response, the anger, disappointment, and lingering love that complicated my strategic thinking. "How do I separate justice from vengeance?" I asked him. "Protection from punishment?" "By remembering that true justice includes opportunity for redemption," he suggested. "Your preparations created consequences for their actions. Now you must decide what restoration might look like if they choose that path." As evening approached, I made one final call to Catherine Reynolds at the district attorney's office, confirming our contingency plan should my children fail to meet my requirements. "The evidence you've provided supports multiple felony charges," she reminded me. "Once formally filed, I would have limited discretion to withdraw them, regardless of family reconciliation." "I understand," I said. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." With my support network activated and resources in place, I prepared for my children's response. I'd created a comprehensive defense system, legal, financial, medical, and community-based, that would make further attempts at exploitation virtually impossible. Yet beneath these practical preparations lay a more profound gathering of internal strength, the resolve to face whatever came next without surrendering my autonomy or compromising my principles. I spent that evening in my pottery studio, losing myself in the centering process that had become both hobby and metaphor since retirement. As my hands shaped resistant clay into balanced forms, I reflected on how crisis had forced me to recenter my own life, establishing boundaries that should have been created years earlier, claiming power I had gradually surrendered in the name of maternal accommodation. The clay took shape beneath my hands, strong at its core, able to withstand the transformative fire to come. Whatever my children decided, I was prepared. Precisely 24 hours after I had presented my children with their options, my doorbell rang. Through the security monitor Eleanor had insisted I install, I observed all three of them standing on my porch. Caroline in her professional armor of tailored suit and perfect posture, James shifting his weight uncomfortably, Michael staring at the ground. Their body language suggested conflict rather than consensus. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my hands over the simple linen dress I'd chosen for this encounter, and opened the door. "Right on time," I noted, stepping aside to let them enter. "I appreciate punctuality." They filed in silently, tension radiating from their collective presence. I led them to the living room, where yesterday's confrontation had occurred. The folders remained exactly where I'd left them on the coffee table, untouched, still closed, their potential consequences hovering over our gathering like storm clouds. "Please sit," I said, taking my own seat in the armchair that positioned me opposite all three of them. No one spoke for several uncomfortable moments. Caroline finally broke the silence, her lawyer's instinct for opening arguments asserting itself. "We've discussed your concerns," she began, her tone carefully modulated, "and we've taken steps to address them." "Specifically?" I prompted, unwilling to accept vague assurances. James produced a folder of his own. "I've canceled the sale of the house," he said, sliding documents across the table. "Complete reversal of the transaction, signed by all parties. The property remains solely in your name." I examined the paperwork carefully, noting the legitimate signatures and official stamps. "And the financial accounts?" Michael spoke next, his voice subdued. "We've arranged full repayment of all withdrawals," he said, presenting bank transfer confirmations. $67,532.18 has been returned to your primary account, with an additional $4,328.97 in interest. The precise accounting suggested they'd consulted financial and legal advisors overnight, a promising indication they were taking my ultimatum seriously. Yet something in their coordinated responses felt rehearsed, strategic rather than genuinely remorseful. "What about Sunset Meadows?" I asked. "We've canceled all arrangements," Caroline confirmed, producing an email from the facilities director acknowledging withdrawal of my application. "There will be no further discussion of assisted living without your explicit request and involvement." I nodded, acknowledging these concrete steps while noting what remained unaddressed: the fundamental breach of trust, the conspiracy against my autonomy, the willingness to sacrifice my independence for their financial gain. The practical matters were being resolved, but the deeper violation hung unacknowledged between us. "I appreciate these actions," I said carefully, "but they address only the symptoms, not the cause." "What more do you want from us?" James asked, a flash of the old entitlement breaking through his chastened facade. "Understanding," I replied simply. "I want to know why my own children believed they had the right to seize control of my life. I want to hear in your own words what justified forging my signature, stealing my money, and conspiring to have me institutionalized against my will." The direct question landed like a physical blow. Caroline's professional composure faltered. James looked away, Michael's eyes filled with tears. He quickly blinked back. "We were worried about you," Caroline attempted, falling back on their original justification. "No," I interrupted firmly. "Worry leads to conversations, not conspiracies. Try again, with honesty this time." A heavy silence descended, broken finally by Michael's whispered admission. "It was easy." His siblings turned to him in alarm, but he continued, his voice gaining strength as he articulated what none of them had been willing to acknowledge. "You were always so capable, so independent. But you were also trusting, generous to a fault. We started with small things, borrowing without asking, using your resources as if they were communal property. You rarely objected." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. The boundaries kept shifting. What would have been unthinkable 10 years ago became justifiable, then routine. We told ourselves we deserved it. After all, we were family. Your assets would eventually be ours anyway. "Michael, stop," Caroline hissed, but he shook his head. "No, she deserves the truth. We're here because we were caught, not because we realized we were wrong. He turned back to me. The house plan started as James's idea, but we all embraced it. The property values in this neighborhood have nearly doubled. Selling meant immediate access to funds we'd otherwise wait years to inherit. The brutal honesty struck me more powerfully than their earlier evasions. And my supposed cognitive decline? The justification for Sunset Meadows? James answered this time, his natural charm nowhere in evidence. A convenient narrative. You occasionally misplaced things, sometimes forgot details of conversations. Normal aging, but enough to build a case if selectively documented. We only needed to convince a sympathetic judge that you required supervision. You're making this worse, Caroline muttered, professional damage control instincts kicking in. No, I'm making it honest, James countered. We've spent the night consulting attorneys who outlined our legal exposure. The evidence Mom has collected could send us to prison, destroy our careers, devastate our families. Those folders, he gestured to the untouched documents on the table, contain enough ammunition to ruin us completely. He leaned forward, desperation edging his voice. What we did was wrong, illegal, unforgivable. We know that now, but we're still your children. Surely that counts for something. The naked appeal struck at my most vulnerable point. The maternal instinct to protect that had defined my existence for decades. Yet beneath his apparent contrition, I detected familiar manipulation, the assumption that family ties would ultimately outweigh accountability, that my love would once again excuse their transgressions. Yes, you are my children, I acknowledged, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. Which is why those folders remain closed rather than in the district attorney's hands. But being my children doesn't grant immunity from consequences or guarantee automatic forgiveness. I stood then, moving to the window that overlooked the garden where they had played as children, where I had taught them to identify flowers and vegetables, to respect growing things. What happens next depends on actions, not words or promises. Turning back to face them, I delivered the terms I had carefully considered during the long night. For the next 6 months, there will be no unsupervised access to my home, no involvement in my financial affairs, no decisions made on my behalf without explicit, documented consent. During that time, I expect each of you to engage in family counseling, individually and together. Caroline began to object, but I raised my hand. These aren't suggestions. They're requirements for any potential rebuilding of trust. The alternative is in those folders. The ultimatum hung in the air between us, reshaping the family dynamic that had enabled their betrayal. For the first time in decades, I wasn't asking or accommodating. I was directing, boundaries firmly established and consequences clearly defined. Do you understand and accept these terms? I asked. One by one, they nodded. Caroline reluctantly, James calculatingly, Michael with what appeared to be genuine remorse. Then we have a foundation to build upon, I said, neither celebrating nor condemning. The choice to create something better rests with each of you. The 6 months following our confrontation unfolded with cautious, measured steps toward accountability. My children complied with my requirements, not enthusiastically at first, but with increasing engagement as the reality of their situation settled into understanding. Caroline was the most resistant initially. Accustomed to controlling professional and family dynamics, she struggled with her diminished influence over my affairs. Her attempts to expedite the process through performative compliance were met with gentle but firm redirection from Dr. Amelia Santos, the family therapist I'd selected for her sessions. Control is your comfort zone, I overheard Dr. Santos telling her during a joint session 3 months in. But rebuilding trust requires surrendering that control and accepting vulnerability. I was trying to protect her, Caroline insisted, the familiar justification emerging reflexively. Were you? Dr. Santos asked simply. Or were you protecting your access to resources while avoiding the emotional work of genuine relationship? The question lingered unanswered, but I noticed subtle shifts in Caroline's behavior afterward, less directive, more attentive, occasionally allowing glimpses of uncertainty beneath her polished facade. James approached the rehabilitation process strategically, as I'd expected. Ever the negotiator. He initially viewed therapy and boundary adherence as transactions to be completed efficiently rather than transformative opportunities. Yet the skilled counselor I'd paired him with, Dr. Robert Chen, recognized this pattern from his work with high-functioning addicts. Compliance without insight is temporary, he told James during our quarterly progress meeting. You're fulfilling requirements while maintaining the same internal narratives that justified your original actions. The observation struck a nerve. 2 weeks later, James requested an individual meeting with me, our first unsupervised conversation since the confrontation. I've been thinking about patterns, he said, sitting awkwardly in my kitchen where we'd shared countless meals. Dad modeled financial manipulation as normal, the secret accounts, the hidden debts you discovered after his death. I watched you struggle to recover from his deceptions, then adopted the same behaviors myself. He paused, struggling visibly with the recognition. I became what I claimed to despise. The acknowledgement represented genuine progress, connecting behavior to deeper patterns rather than circumstantial justifications. Michael's journey proved most surprising. Initially devastated by the confrontation and his role in the betrayal, he withdrew almost completely for the first month. His therapist, Dr. Lakshmi Patel, reported minimal engagement in their sessions. Then, something shifted after he brought his son Thomas to visit under the supervised conditions I'd established. "Grandma, why can't Dad come over by himself anymore?" Thomas asked innocently while helping me in the garden. The question forced Michael to explain, in age-appropriate terms, that he had broken trust and was working to rebuild it. The conversation became a turning point in his therapy. Explaining my actions to my son made them real in a way nothing else had, he told me later. I couldn't hide behind justifications when translating my behavior for a child's understanding. The most profound consequence, however, was invisible to outside observation: the internal restructuring of my relationship with my children. The reflexive accommodation that had characterized my maternal approach for decades gave way to clearly articulated expectations. Generosity became conditional rather than automatic. Trust evolved from assumed to earned. This recalibration didn't diminish my love, but clarified its expression. Justice, in our case, wasn't punitive but restorative, creating a framework where genuine relationship could potentially replace the transactional dynamic that had enabled betrayal. As the 6-month probationary period drew to a close, the landscape of my family relationships had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The changes weren't merely in my children's behavior, but in my own sense of identity and authority within our family system. I no longer hesitated to decline requests that crossed my boundaries. When James asked to borrow money for a quote, guaranteed investment opportunity, I refused without elaborate justification or guilt. When Caroline suggested combining Thanksgiving celebrations at her home to make things easier for everyone, I maintained my tradition of hosting in my own space, on my own terms. When Michael proposed cataloging my art collection for insurance purposes, I simply smiled and said, "That won't be necessary." Each refusal represented not punishment, but reclamation of autonomy, of self-determination, of the right to make decisions without prioritizing others' convenience or preferences above my own needs. My children's responses to these boundaries revealed their individual progress. Caroline initially bristled at what she perceived as rejection, but gradually came to respect my decisions without taking them personally. James tested limits occasionally, but accepted refusals with diminishing resistance. Michael, perhaps most transformed, often anticipated boundaries before I needed to articulate them. "I was thinking of helping organize your studio," he mentioned during a visit, then immediately added, "But I realize that's your private space. Maybe you could show me some of your recent work instead, if you're comfortable sharing it." The adjustment recognized my autonomy rather than assuming access, a small but significant shift in perspective that acknowledged me as an individual rather than an extension of his needs. Physical boundaries reinforced these interpersonal ones. I changed the locks on my home, providing new keys only to Eleanor and Margaret for emergency purposes. I installed a comprehensive security system with cameras monitoring all entrances. I created a separate guest Wi-Fi network that couldn't access my personal devices or files. These measures weren't punitive but protective, establishing clear delineation between welcome presence and unwelcome intrusion. Financial boundaries became similarly explicit. I revoked all remaining co-signing arrangements and joint account access. I established clear documentation requirements for any financial interactions with my children, including gift tax filings, for significant contributions to grandchildren's education or special occasions. I maintained separate accounts at different financial institutions for different purposes: everyday expenses, travel fund, emergency reserves, with varying levels of disclosure about their existence and balances. The most profound transformation, however, occurred in my internal landscape. The hypervigilance that had characterized the months leading up to the confrontation gradually softened into mindful awareness. I no longer felt compelled to document every interaction or analyze every conversation for hidden agendas. Instead, I observed patterns with clarity while remaining open to evidence of genuine change. "You seem more peaceful," Margaret noted during one of our regular lunches. "Less burdened." "I am," I acknowledged. "When you stop carrying others' responsibilities, your own become lighter." This lightness extended beyond family dynamics into other areas of my life. I pursued interests I'd previously deferred, taking a watercolor workshop in Santa Fe, volunteering with a literacy program at the local elementary school, accepting an invitation to join the board of the Community Arts Foundation. I reclaimed not just boundaries but possibilities, expanding my identity beyond maternal roles and obligations. On the anniversary of the confrontation, my 61st birthday, I invited my children for a carefully structured dinner. The event wasn't a celebration of complete restoration, but an acknowledgement of progress made and work continuing. As they gathered somewhat tentatively in my dining room, I raised a toast that encapsulated the journey. "To boundaries that protect rather than isolate," I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn, "and to the courage required to maintain them from both sides." Their responses: Caroline's thoughtful nod, James's rueful smile, Michael's whispered "thank you," suggested understanding, if not complete transformation. The path forward remained uncertain, but the direction was clear: toward relationships built on respect rather than exploitation, on mutuality rather than manipulation, on boundaries that created safety for authentic connection. The ripples from my family's crisis extended far beyond our private reconciliation, touching others in ways I hadn't anticipated when focused solely on my own protection. 3 months after our confrontation, I received a call from Mary Ann Peterson, a 72-year-old widow from my church congregation. "Eleanor suggested I contact you," she began hesitantly. "My son has been pressuring me to add him to my accounts. For emergencies, he says. But something doesn't feel right." The familiar pattern triggered immediate recognition. We met for coffee the following day, where Mary Ann shared details that echoed my own experience. Subtle pressure escalating over time, important documents disappearing, unexplained withdrawals from her checking account. The isolation she described, being gradually separated from friends who might notice these changes, was textbook predatory behavior. "I don't want to believe he would take advantage," she confessed, tears gathering. "He's my only child." "Love and exploitation can exist simultaneously," I told her gently. "Protecting yourself doesn't mean you've stopped loving him." With my guidance, Mary Ann established basic safeguards, separate accounts her son couldn't access, updated legal documents with an independent attorney, a security system for her home. More importantly, she reconnected with her social network, reducing the isolation that had made her vulnerable. Word spread. Within weeks, I found myself having similar conversations with other seniors in my community, some already experiencing financial exploitation, others recognizing warning signs in their family dynamics. Each situation was unique, yet patterns emerged consistently: adult children facing financial pressures, seniors with significant assets but diminishing social connections, boundaries eroded through incremental testing rather than sudden demands. "You should formalize this somehow," Eleanor suggested after I mentioned helping 3 more seniors in a single week. "Your experience and legal background make you uniquely qualified." The suggestion crystallized into action. Working with Eleanor, Pastor Kellerman, and Dr. Santos, I established a monthly support group called Boundaries and Belonging at the community center. What began with 5 participants grew to 15, then 30. Not just seniors experiencing family exploitation, but adult children struggling to navigate care decisions ethically, professionals seeking to identify vulnerable clients, and community advocates wanting to address systemic issues. I shared my story openly in these sessions, neither minimizing my children's actions nor demonizing them as irredeemable. The nuance resonated particularly with participants caught in the painful space between self-protection and family loyalty. "You've given me permission to love my daughter while still saying no to her demands," Irene Goldman told me after one session, her relief palpable. "I didn't know that was possible." The work expanded beyond support into education. I developed a workshop series on financial autonomy for seniors, collaborating with Raymond Chen to offer practical strategies for maintaining independence while planning responsibly for changing capabilities. Local law enforcement invited me to contribute to their elder fraud training, providing insider perspective on how family exploitation often begins with seemingly benign interventions. Most unexpectedly, my experience influenced institutional policies. When Sunset Meadows director contacted me 6 months after our confrontation, ostensibly to check whether I'd reconsidered their services, I used the opportunity to discuss how their admission procedures enabled potential exploitation. "Your intake process never included direct conversation with me," I pointed out. "All arrangements were made through my children, despite policies claiming to prioritize prospective residents' autonomy." The observation prompted an internal review that ultimately led to revised admission protocols requiring documented consent from seniors themselves, separate interviews without family present, and clear documentation of capacity assessment when cognitive issues were alleged. These wider impacts gave purpose to my painful experience, transforming private trauma into public benefit. The betrayal that had threatened to diminish my life instead expanded it, creating connections and contributions I couldn't have anticipated when focused solely on self-protection. "Your worst experience became your most valuable credential," Margaret observed as we watched a particularly powerful support group session where participants openly shared their struggles and strategies. Not despite the betrayal, I realized, but because of it. The very vulnerability I feared most became the source of my greatest strength. 2 years after my children attempted to claim my home and freedom, I sat in my garden on the morning of my 62nd birthday, watching sunrise illuminate the Japanese maple now in its full summer glory. The tree had weathered storms, periods of drought, and even an early frost, yet it stood resilient, perhaps more beautiful for having endured these challenges. Like the tree, I had not merely survived but flourished in ways that would have been impossible without the crisis that forced deep-rooted change. The painful pruning of exploitative relationships had created space for new growth, professional contributions, community connections, and a self-understanding that transcended familial roles. My relationship with my children continued to evolve, neither fully restored to blind trust, nor permanently severed by past betrayal. We existed in a carefully calibrated space of conditional engagement, where respect for boundaries remained the prerequisite for continued connection. Caroline had gradually accepted this new reality, her initial resistance giving way to grudging respect for my autonomy. James maintained strategic compliance, though occasional testing of limits suggested old patterns remained dormant rather than transformed. Michael showed the most profound change, our relationship developing a transparency and mutual respect that felt genuinely renewed rather than merely repaired. The wisdom gained through this journey revealed itself in layers, each insight building upon the last. First came the recognition that love and exploitation can coexist, that those who profess care may simultaneously cause harm, not through malicious intent but through entitlement that justifies self-serving actions. Next emerged the understanding that boundaries aren't selfish but essential, that clearly defined limits protect both the vulnerable and those tempted to exploit vulnerability, creating space where genuine relationship becomes possible. Most profound was the realization that age need not diminish autonomy. That experience, when coupled with strategic preparation, creates protection more powerful than physical strength or social position. These insights weren't theoretical but embodied in daily choices. Declining requests that once would have triggered automatic accommodation, expressing needs that previously remained unvoiced, claiming space and time without justification or apology. Perhaps the most unexpected wisdom came in recognizing how crisis had clarified purpose. The betrayal intended to diminish my life had instead expanded it, creating meaningful contribution from painful experience. The support groups and educational programs I developed had helped dozens of seniors recognize and resist exploitation while maintaining family connections where possible. As the garden filled with morning light, I reflected on the central paradox of my journey, that my children's attempt to control me had ultimately liberated me from patterns of accommodation that had limited my own potential for decades. Their betrayal, intended to confine, had instead released me into fuller expression of my capabilities and convictions. The Japanese maple cast dappled shadows across the garden path, its branches reaching toward light, rather than collapsing under the weight of past storms. I had learned to do the same, to grow not despite adversity but through it, finding strength in vulnerability, wisdom in painful experience, and unexpected purpose in betrayal's aftermath. This was the inheritance worth claiming, not property or possessions, but the profound understanding that our value exists independent of others' validation, that our boundaries deserve respect regardless of relationship, and that our final chapters may contain our most meaningful contributions if we refuse to surrender authorship of our own lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.